It was rough. Musicians union was there, but they weren't of much help at the time. I was never happy. I guess what drives me to tear things apart.
There is something almost mythological about Eddie Van Halen, the man with the striped guitar, the wild grin, and fingers that move faster than most people could think. He was the guitarist who made an entire generation throw away their picks, grab a neck, and start tapping. He was the reason bedroom musicians stayed up until 3 in the morning rewinding cassette tapes, frame by frame, trying to understand what on earth was happening in those 27 seconds of eruption. He was, by almost universal agreement, the most influential rock guitarist of his generation. But legends are rarely simple. Behind that infectious laugh and those supernatural solos lived a man who felt things deeply, who carried wounds quietly, and who had complicated, sometimes painful relationships with the very guitarists who shaped him and the ones who followed in his wake. Eddie Van Halen was human in the fullest sense. He had heroes who broke his heart, peers who dismissed him with a cold stare, rivals who borrowed his fire without asking, and competitors whose talent stirred something complicated inside him that he could never quite name. By the time Eddie reached his early 60s, the decades had given him perspective. The raw wounds had healed into scar tissue, and that scar tissue had become wisdom. He could look back with a clarity that only time provides, and in doing so, he let slip names, feelings, and stories that painted an entirely different portrait of rock's golden age. Not the glamorous version you see in documentaries, the real one, full of jealousy and admiration twisted together so tightly you could hardly tell them apart. What follows is the story of 6 guitarists who made Eddie Van Halen feel something he didn't always know how to handle. Whether it was heartbreak, frustration, competitive fire, or that strange mixture of awe and resentment that only exists between 2 great artists. Each of these men left a mark on Eddie that ran far deeper than any guitar string. These are the 6 guitarists Eddie Van Halen, had he lived to 62 and beyond, would have called the most complicated relationships of his musical life. The 6 he admired most, the 6 who hurt him most, the 6 he could never quite forget. Every guitarist has an origin story, and Eddie Van Halen's begins not on a stage but in a modest bedroom in Pasadena, California, where a young boy sat cross-legged on the floor with a cheap guitar balanced on his knee and a stack of Cream records propped against the wall. Night after night, he would drop the needle on those records and sit in silence, listening, learning, absorbing. Of all the sounds that shaped him in those early years, none left a deeper impression than the playing of Eric Clapton. To the teenage Eddie, Clapton was not merely a musician. He was a force of nature. The way Clapton bent a string on Crossroads, the way a single note could carry the weight of genuine emotion, the way his playing breathed and paused and surged with something that felt entirely human, it was unlike anything Eddie had encountered. He would spend hours dissecting those solos, not just learning the notes, but trying to understand the feeling behind them. Clapton, in those formative years, was the reason Eddie Van Halen decided that the guitar was his calling. That kind of early devotion leaves a permanent mark. It shapes not just the hands but the soul. And so when Eddie Van Halen burst onto the scene in 1978 with a debut album that redrew the boundaries of what an electric guitar could do, part of him was still that Pasadena kid hoping that somewhere out there his hero was listening and nodding with approval. What he got instead was something far colder. When Clapton was asked about Van Halen in the early 1980s, his response was measured but devastating. He acknowledged Eddie's technical ability, but suggested he heard very little genuine soul in the playing. For most musicians, that might have been brushed off as one man's opinion. For Eddie, it was a dagger. Because this wasn't just any man, this was the man who had lit the fire. This was the guitarist whose records Eddie had worn down to near silence trying to learn from. To have that man dismiss his work as technically impressive but emotionally hollow was, by Eddie's own admission, heartbreaking. What made it even more complicated was that Eddie understood on some level where Clapton was coming from. Their philosophies were genuinely different. Clapton came from the British blues tradition, where restraint was a virtue, and every note carried the gravity of the music that birthed it. Eddie came from somewhere else entirely, a place of pure invention and joyful chaos, where distortion was a language and feedback was beautiful. They were not playing the same game, and perhaps that made it impossible for Clapton to hear what Eddie was doing in the way Eddie needed him to hear it. But here's the thing about deep admiration. It does not simply disappear because the admired person disappoints you. Eddie never stopped loving what Clapton had built. He never stopped referencing those early Cream records as the foundation of his musical education. Even in his later years, when asked about the guitarists who mattered most to his development, Clapton's name came first. The heartbreak was real, but so was the love. And in some ways that made the whole story even sadder, because the relationship Eddie had with Clapton was largely one-sided. A fan who grew into a peer and discovered that his hero had never quite seen him as an equal. The two men met in person on a handful of occasions, and by all accounts those meetings were polite but lacking the warmth Eddie had hoped for. He had dreamed of something like brotherhood, two guitarists from different eras finding common ground. What he found instead was a civil exchange between strangers. It stayed with him, not as bitterness exactly, but as a quiet sadness that never fully resolved itself. If Eric Clapton represented Eddie Van Halen's blues education, then Ritchie Blackmore represented something closer to his rock education. Deep Purple records were staples in the Van Halen household during Eddie's teenage years, and Blackmore's playing, with its combination of classical discipline and hard rock ferocity, fascinated Eddie in ways that were different from Clapton but no less profound. He studied Blackmore's technique obsessively, drawn to the precision of it, the way every solo felt both inevitable and dangerous, like a controlled explosion. By the late 1970s, when Van Halen had become one of the most exciting new bands in rock, Eddie found himself sharing stages and circuits with the musicians he had grown up worshipping. He was no longer the kid in the bedroom. He was the headliner, the sensation, the name on everyone's lips. And yet, in the presence of his heroes, he reverted to something younger and more vulnerable. He wanted acknowledgement. He wanted the men who had shaped him to look at what he had built and recognize their influence in it. What he got from Ritchie Blackmore was something closer to a cold wall. By multiple accounts, including Eddie's own recollections shared with guitar journalists in the early 1980s, Blackmore was dismissive almost to the point of rudeness. There was no warmth, no acknowledgement, no shared moment of musical kinship. Eddie described the experience as being looked straight through, as though he were invisible. For a man as genuinely open and enthusiastic as Eddie Van Halen, that kind of deliberate coldness was difficult to process. Blackmore's eventual public assessment of Eddie's playing followed the same pattern as many of his generational peers. He acknowledged the talent in a way that subtly undermined it, suggesting that Eddie played too many notes, implying that quantity had replaced quality. It was the classic critique from an older school of playing against a newer one, and it stung precisely because it missed the point entirely. Eddie wasn't playing a lot of notes because he lacked restraint. He was playing them because he had discovered a new vocabulary and was drunk on its possibilities. What made the Blackmore dynamic particularly interesting was how much they actually had in common beneath the surface tension. Both men were obsessive about tone. Both built or modified their own equipment. Both were essentially loners in terms of their creative process. Men who heard music in their heads and then spent years building instruments and systems capable of producing it. Had they managed to find a way past the ego and the generational posturing, they might have had one of the great musical conversations of the era. Instead, they remained separated by a chill that neither fully broke down. Blackmore in later years did soften his assessments and acknowledge that what Eddie had contributed to the language of rock guitar was genuine and significant. But by the time those words came, Eddie had long since stopped needing them. He had built his own legacy, constructed entirely on his own terms, with or without Blackmore's blessing. The late 1970s were a strange and electric time to be a young rock guitarist. The old guard was still very much present. Aerosmith and their ilk-wooling arenas with a hard, swaggering blues rock that had defined the decade. And then Van Halen arrived, this explosive California band with a guitarist who seemed to be playing a completely different instrument than everyone else. Even though it was technically the same 6-string electric guitar everyone had been playing for decades. Joe Perry, Aerosmith's lead guitarist and one of the defining rock players of the 1970s, represented a kind of establishment that Eddie was simultaneously part of and apart from. They were on the same circuit, playing the same venues, appealing to overlapping audiences. But their musical DNA could not have been more different. Perry's playing was rooted in the blues, in attitude and groove, and a kind of casual mastery that made everything look effortless. Eddie's playing was something else, something that made other guitarists pause mid-sentence and stare at the stage with their mouths slightly open. Eddie's recollections of his early interactions with Perry were not warm. He described a pattern he encountered repeatedly during those early touring years: heroes and established players who offered nothing when they crossed paths. No handshake, no acknowledgement, just a cold indifference that Eddie interpreted, probably correctly, as a mixture of dismissal and threat. He was the new thing, and the new thing was making the old thing look suddenly dated. It takes a particular kind of confidence to look at someone who has just reinvented your instrument and respond with warmth rather than defensiveness. Perry, during those early years, did not manage it, and Eddie noticed. He was not a man who needed constant validation, but he was someone who valued genuine human connection, and the wall he encountered in players like Perry left him feeling isolated in a world where he should have been celebrated. The deeper irony is that Perry clearly understood, even if he didn't show it at the time, exactly what Eddie had done. Years later, Perry's reflections on Van Halen's debut album were nothing short of reverent. He described hearing it for the first time as a genuinely disorienting experience, the kind of listening moment that makes you question everything you thought you knew about your own instrument. He was floored by it, even if he couldn't admit that in real time. Eddie, to his enormous credit, never let the early coldness permanently poison his feelings about Perry as a guitarist. He understood what Aerosmith had built, what Perry's playing meant to a generation, and he carried that understanding with him, even through the sting of being ignored. It was one of his most endearing qualities. He could be hurt and still hold the music in the same high regard. The two things coexisted in him without contradiction. Not every complicated relationship in Eddie Van Halen's life was built on coldness or dismissal. Some were built on something stranger, the feeling of watching someone hold up a mirror to your work and not quite do it justice. Tom Scholz, the famously reclusive MIT-educated genius behind Boston, occupied a unique place in the landscape of late 1970s rock guitar, and his relationship with Eddie was one of the most unusual and, in its own way, most revealing of all. Scholz was in many ways Eddie's opposite. Where Eddie built his Frankenstrat through intuition and improvisation, soldering and sawing and blowing things up, until he found the sound he was hearing in his head, Scholz approached instrument building and tone design like an engineering problem to be solved. His Rockman amplifier system became one of the defining sounds of arena rock, a perfectly calibrated, scientifically precise tone machine. He was brilliant, thorough, and deeply private, a man who preferred the controlled environment of a recording studio to the chaotic energy of a live stage. The story that defined their dynamic happened at a shared outdoor show in the late 1970s. Van Halen played first, and Eddie delivered one of his typically incendiary solos, the kind that left the crowd buzzing and the other musicians watching from the wings with a mixture of awe and bewilderment. Then Boston took the stage, and to Eddie's profound surprise and irritation, Scholz proceeded to incorporate elements of Eddie's solo into his own performance, right there, in front of the same audience, with Eddie watching from the side of the stage. The anger Eddie felt in that moment was real and immediate. This was not about flattery or imitation in the abstract. This was someone taking what you had just done and presenting it on the same stage without acknowledgement. Eddie was furious, and while he handled it without a public confrontation, the frustration stayed with him. It fed into a broader anxiety he was beginning to feel as his technique spread through the guitar world with astonishing speed. Everyone was tapping now. Everyone was diving with the whammy bar. The ideas he had spent years developing in private were becoming common currency. What complicated his feelings about Scholz was the grudging respect that coexisted with the frustration. He could not help but admire a man who had built his own equipment from scratch, who had done the work of a genuine inventor in service of his music. That was something Eddie understood in his bones, and over time, as the immediate anger faded, what remained was a more nuanced appreciation for what Scholz had achieved, even if the way he had achieved it had occasionally borrowed from Eddie's playbook without permission. Of all the stories in Eddie Van Halen's complicated gallery of musical rivalries, the one involving Rick Derringer has a directness to it that the others lack. There was no ambiguity, no years later interpretation, no wondering what was really meant. What happened between Eddie and Derringer happened in real time, in public, and Eddie confronted it directly and immediately. Derringer was not an unknown. He was a respected veteran of the rock world, a genuinely talented guitarist with a real history and a real reputation. He was someone Eddie had grown up admiring, and when Van Halen found themselves sharing a bill with Derringer in the late 1970s, Eddie approached the situation with his characteristic openness and enthusiasm. What unfolded left him shaken. Derringer, performing in front of the same crowd that had just watched Eddie play, incorporated elements of Eddie's solo into his own set with a specificity that went far beyond homage. Not the general technique, not the tapping method in the abstract, the actual melodic content, the specific notes and phrasing that Eddie had just played, delivered back to the same audience that had just heard them from their originator. Eddie confronted him. He was direct, but not cruel. He told Derringer plainly that while he had no issue with Derringer using whatever techniques he found useful, playing his specific melodies back at him in front of the same crowd was something he was not going to accept. It was a line that needed to be drawn, and Eddie drew it clearly and without drama. When Derringer repeated the offense the following night, the matter was resolved with equal directness. He was removed from the tour. What made this episode particularly resonant was the emotional complexity Eddie admitted to feeling about it. He acknowledged that, in his younger years, he had learned from Derringer, had absorbed things from Derringer's playing and incorporated them into his own development. There was a cycle of influence at work, and Eddie was honest enough to recognize his own place in it. What separated legitimate influence from what Derringer had done was the directness of the replication. One is learning, the other is copying. Eddie knew the difference because he had lived both sides of it. The episode sharpened something in him. Fame, he was learning, came with a particular kind of vulnerability. The more original your work, the more it attracted imitation. And while imitation could be the sincerest form of flattery in some abstract philosophical sense, it felt very different when experienced in the specific and concrete reality of a shared stage with your name on the bill. And then there was Randy Rhoads. Of all the guitarists in Eddie Van Halen's complicated emotional landscape, Randy Rhoads occupies the most unique and perhaps the most painful position, because what Eddie felt about Rhoads was not quite admiration and not quite rivalry and not quite resentment. It was something in between all three, a feeling so layered and so human that it resists simple categorization. Randy Rhoads arrived in the early 1980s as the guitarist for Ozzy Osbourne's new band, and he arrived like a thunderclap. He was classically trained where Eddie was self-taught. He was disciplined where Eddie was instinctive. He was precise where Eddie was volcanic, and yet the comparisons between them were immediate and relentless, because what Rhoads was doing on stage and on record carried clear echoes of the revolution that Eddie had started just a few years earlier. Eddie heard those echoes. He heard them clearly, and his response, by his own honest admission, was complicated. On one level, he recognized Rhoads' talent. He was not the kind of man who could listen to someone genuinely gifted and pretend otherwise. But on another level, he bristled at the comparisons, and at the sense that the techniques and approaches he had pioneered were now being associated primarily with someone who had come after him. He felt, not entirely without justification, that the credit was being redistributed in ways that didn't quite add up. He said as much, in his characteristic way, acknowledging Rhodes' honesty in citing his influence while simultaneously insisting that Rhodes had not done anything that he himself had not done first. It was equal parts compliment and territorial claim, the statement of a man who had worked enormously hard to build something original and felt, perhaps understandably, protective of it. What makes the Rhodes chapter different from all the others is what happened next, or rather, what did not happen. In March of 1982, Randy Rhodes died in a plane crash at the age of 25. He was young, he was brilliant, and he was gone before any of the complicated feelings between him and Eddie had the chance to evolve. There was no reconciliation, no later interview where one of them said something generous about the other, no shared stage moment where the rivalry dissolved into mutual respect. Just the frozen complexity of two great guitarists caught at the height of their competition, and then silence. Eddie rarely spoke about Rhodes in his later years, and when he did, the sharpness was gone. What replaced it was something quieter and harder to name. Perhaps it was grief. Perhaps it was the particular weight that comes from unresolved conflict with someone who is no longer alive to participate in its resolution. Perhaps it was the recognition that the rivalry had mattered so much precisely because Rhodes was so genuinely exceptional. There is a thought that suggests itself when you look at this relationship honestly. Maybe Eddie did not hate Randy Rhodes. Maybe what he felt was something far more uncomfortable than hate. Maybe he saw in Rhodes a mirror, someone who had found his own path to the same destination, and that reflection unsettled him in ways that were difficult to articulate. The most intense reactions we have to other people are rarely really about those people. They are about the parts of ourselves that those people illuminate. What do you do with a legacy like Eddie Van Halen's? You listen to it. You study it. You try to understand not just what he played, but what he felt while he was playing it. Because it turns out that the guitarist who changed everything was also a man who could be hurt by a hero's dismissal, stung by a peer's coldness, angered by a rival's imitation, and shaken by the complexity of watching someone brilliant come close behind him. These 6 relationships with Clapton, Blackmore, Perry, Scholes, Derringer, and Rhodes tell us something essential about what it costs to be genuinely original. Originality is not comfortable. It makes enemies of the people who came before you and rivals of the people who come after. It invites imitation and sometimes steals credit. It requires you to defend something as intimate as your own voice against people who want to borrow it without asking. Eddie Van Halen defended his voice his whole life, not always with words, mostly with music, with those astonishing solos that kept redefining what was possible long after everyone assumed he had already said everything there was to say. He kept going. He kept inventing. He kept chasing sounds that didn't yet exist. And in the end, even the people who had dismissed him, doubted him, ignored him, or borrowed from him without permission came to the same conclusion. He was the real thing. He was, and remains, irreplaceable.